The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Where there is no imagination, there is no horror. Words have no power to impress the mind without the exquisite horror of their reality. When you look fear in the face, you are able to say to yourself, I lived through this horror. I can take the next thing that comes along. Horror fiction shows us that the control we believe we have is purely illusory, and that every moment we teeter on chaos and oblivion. The monster was the best friend I ever had. Horror films don't create fear. They release it. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. There is a mystery about this which stimulates the imagination. Where there is no imagination, there is no horror. Horror alone brings peace of mind. There is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. Horror is beyond the reach of psychology. I came to the conclusion that in comedy, everybody gets what they need, whereas in horror, everybody gets what they deserve. I decided that at the end of the day, I was going to give everybody what they needed. You know, the best thing you can say about a horror film is, don't see it. The greatest horrors of our world are committed by people who are totally sincere. Ultimate horror often paralyzes memory in a merciful way. Even as a child, I felt in my heart two opposite emotions, the horror of life and the ecstasy of life. The dream reveals the reality which conception lags behind. That is the horror of life, the terror of art. I love when you go to a horror film with real horror fans and everybody's there watching, getting involved and screaming. That's when it's most alive and exciting for me. Horror and moral terror are your friends. Art in nature is rhythmic and has a horror of constraint. Any horror element is as much psychological as special effects. Any peace process after so many years of horror and terror will be long and difficult. I love the idea that horror and fear is a celebration of health and life. Horror and supernatural novels give you a lot of what you look for in a crime novel, just with a twist that was very fresh for me as a reader. I love my horror films and they will always be very close to me. I don't share lots of the phobias that horror movies tap into. I don't mind spiders or snakes or darkness. Psychological horror is more interesting to me than the explicitly physical. When I was a kid, I was really into horror films. I watched every single horror film that came out in the 80s. Anytime a new horror film comes out that looks appealing, I'm always excited to go see it. I guessed his name was Face of Horror. I wondered how long it had taken his mom to think of that. Bob? No. Sam? No. How about Face of Horror? It is not possible to create the opposite of what one has always known, simply because the opposite is believed to be desired. Human beings need what they already know, even horrors. My imagination persisted in sticking horrors into the dark, so I stuck my imagination into the dark instead, and let it look out at me. My life has been a remarkable one. Maybe one day someone will write a book about me. I've never much cared for horror stories. Love only brought me loneliness and horror. Everything written is at least in part fantasy. Except maybe the national budget. That's horror. The depressed person was in terrible and unceasing pain, and the impossibility of sharing or articulating this pain was itself a component of the pain and a contributing factor in its essential horror. No new horror can be more terrible than the daily torture of the commonplace. There was a brief pause for them to evaluate the full horror of the situation. Magnus, personally, was in horror up to his elbows. Don't forget to subscribe. Quotes Mag.